Hello, my name is Garvin, and I read things and blather about them on the internet for your entertainment. Last week, I took a look at the Greek Alexander romance, and while it's a fascinating story, especially when you realize this was basically a fantasy novel written about a real person, I was surprised to see something missing, something I expected to be there. It was a story about Alexander shutting away terrible things from the rest of the world. So, if that story wasn't in the Greek Alexander romance, where did it come from? And I'm sure some of you are asking, what story am I even talking about? Let's turn to. First, a quick note on my sources. So I am using a number of online sources, but I'm also using two books. First, Alexander the Great, A History of His Legend by Richard Stoneman, and the book The Medieval Romance of Alexander, translated by Nigel Bryant. There'll be links to the books and the online sources in the description below, just in case you're wondering where I'm pulling all this craziness from. So, let's take a look at the story, which has a number of versions, but I'm going to give you the basics here. Alexander the Great is campaigning in the north, or in some versions the far east. Either way, it's a place far away from wherever you're telling the story and very mountainous. And he runs into a group of human nations that are incredibly vile. They're almost always cannibals, and in some versions they eat puppies, kittens, and the unborn. And I don't think I can go into further detail without upsetting our Dreadlord algorithm, so I won't. They're accused of other vile practices, but no real detail is given, so whatever you consider to be morally terrible, that's them. They are the worst people you know. Although, eating the unborn kind of does it for me just on its own, honestly. Alexander is so disgusted by these people that he rounds them up and drives them into a place surrounded by mountains that cannot be climbed. He then prays to the Almighty, who reaches forth and closes the mountain together so that the unclean nations have their called cannot spread their practices to others. Now, in other versions, the Almighty does leave a gap in the mountains, and Alexander builds a wall with a gate across that gap by melting together great blocks of iron, and then pouring molten bronze over the iron to create a rust-proof coating. And it's said that the unclean nations are thus imprisoned until the end of the millennium, at which point they will be free to march out and join Satan under the leadership of Gog and Magog to wage war on the rest of humanity and, the biblical God. I'm sure that'll go great for them. Another more colorful version of the story is that Alexander comes across a great city with a citadel around it, where the dwellers of the cities keep the gates closed and dance all day and all night to the music of organs, reeds, flutes, horns, and drums. Heck of a band. It takes a bit for the army to break into the city, but when they do, they find a vile, degenerate people dancing to music being played by mechanical men, with mechanical dancers that take over when the people are too tired to dance. So, it's a 24/7 dance party with androids. Alexander realizes this is a false paradise meant to lead people into wicked practices, so he encloses the city to prevent it from luring more people into wickedness. And there, those people remain until, well, you know the rest of this story. And you're likely asking, where did this story come from? So there's a couple things we want to pull together to find the origin of this story. First, we look in the writings of the Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who's known mostly for his work, The Jewish War. Josephus was a Jewish rebel in the First Roman Jewish War, so writing from first-hand experience there, I guess. His side lost and he was taken as a slave and ended up working for the Emperor Vespasian. His work got him freed, and he lived in Rome as a freeman after that. In one of his works, he ties Magog to the steppe peoples by making him the ancestors of the Scythians and saying that the Scythians were the ancestors of all other nomadic groups on the Eurasian steppe. He then writes how Alexander built a wall and a gate to keep the Scythians out of Persia, and that a later king had opened that gate to allow a different nomadic group, the Alans, who in his works were descendants of the Scythians, to rampage into Persia. Later, we find the earliest examples of this story, Alexander closing off the unclean nations with a wall of iron and bronze, or praying the mountains close, in a version of the Alexander romance called the Syranic Alexander romance. And it shows up in Syria among the Christian communities there around the 6th or 7th century AD. The exact date is somewhat disputed. And this version can be kind of considered unofficial Alexander fanfiction. Put a pin on that thought. I'm going to circle back to it. So the Greek Alexander romance that we've covered has been traced back to the 3rd century AD, but we are pretty sure it's older. In fact, we've recently found some fragments that date back to the 1st century BC, which is about 300 years before the 3rd century AD, but still several hundred years after Alexander died. So the Alexander romance that we have is likely the collection of a lot of pre-existing stories. Another piece of evidence for this is how hard the romance works to link Alexander to Egypt. First by claiming him as the biological son of the last pharaoh, and through the mystical connection the story works very hard to forge with Alexander and the gods Serapis and Ammon. And you wouldn't be far wrong to say that, in some sense, the Greek Alexander romance was the official Alexander the Great fanfiction. And as you might guess, there was plenty of unofficial fanfiction that found its way into the Syranic version. And the unofficial stuff is always wilder than the official stuff. You can write that down on your hand. An example of this would be various stories written by the Jewish community, which incorporates Alexander into a monotheistic context. For example, there's a story of him meeting with the priest of Israel and deciding that due to the holiness of the God of Abraham and Moses, he would not bring war to the Israelites. This is likely helped by the fact that the people of Israel also agreed to pay him tribute, mind you. But when the Christian and later Islamic community began creating their own mythology around Alexander, they would borrow heavily from this Jewish tradition, which kind of sums up a lot of Christian and Islamic folklore in a nutshell, doesn't it? Anyways, let's turn from Alexander and talk about who Gog and Magog are. For those of you who grew up in, let's call it, a heavily Christian context like myself, Gog and Magog ring a bell or two, but let's explain for everyone else. So, to dig into this, we have to turn back to the Bible. In Genesis, so all the way back, Genesis chapter 10, Magog is listed as a grandson of Noah. And if we fast forward to Ezekiel, specifically chapters 38 to 39, Gog is a prince of the land of Magog. So it's assumed he's a descendant of the original Magog. And he's also mentioned as a prince of Meshech and Tubal, who are also listed as grandsons of Noah, so it's possible he's the ruler of more than one people or the leader of an alliance of peoples. Anyways, Ezekiel is a prophecy that Prince Gog will lead a vast horde of men against an Israel that has lived in peace so long that it's let all of its defenses fall. This Israel will appear doomed, but the Almighty will strike down this horde, and this horde is so vast that it will take 7 months just to bury the dead. Gog and Magog are also mentioned briefly in Revelations chapter 20, verse 7 to 8, as part of the people who rally to Satan at the end of the millennium. So a basic way to boil this down is that this is a term for Satan-worshipping evildoers who
completely and utterly evil. I live to be bad.
Now, originally the term was Gog from Magog, but over time, tradition changed it to Gog and Magog, turning Magog from a land or a place into an individual or sometimes a tribe. And these kind of shifts happen over time in mythology. Gog and Magog have been identified as Huns, Vikings, Mongols, Turks, just to name a few people who've been hit with this label. Basically, any group of people perceived as coming from outside the civilized world and are considered hostile to the people living in the civilized world are likely to be hit with the title of Gog and Magog. In general terms, this has become a shorthand for wicked forces arrayed against the Almighty and all that is good and pure. In some stories, Gog and Magog have even become giants or demons. But in most of the Christian and Jewish stories I've found, they're simply wicked and rather vile human beings. I do want to note here that growing up, I also heard stories that linked Gog and Magog with demonic possession, the story I heard usually being that they were groups of people who intentionally allowed demons to possess them for various reasons, but I can't find any mythical or folklore sources to back that up. So this might have been something that was just born from the fevered imagination of apocalyptic American Christianity at the end of the 20th century, and this is one of those things, if you know, then you know. I should note there is an independent British tradition where Gog and Magog are actually the name of the giant protectors of London, and this is tied up in the semi-mythical work, The Matter of Britain. I'm not going to go deeper into this because we are going to get to that book eventually on this channel. Getting back to Gog and Magog, this tradition, though, in the Islamic version, they're no longer entirely human, but are described as standing at only half the height of a normal man. They have claws instead of fingernails, a hairy tail and huge hairy ears, which are so big that they can use one ear as a mattress and the other as a cover while they sleep, which does sound a little convenient. They are supposed to spend all night digging at the wall that Alexander built, but the Almighty restores all the damage done to it during the day, so they are going to be stuck digging at this wall until the end of time, where the Almighty will unleash them upon humanity for our sins. Fun times. A couple of points I want to touch on before I go deeper into the Islamic tradition. So, the Islamic tradition draws from the Persian version of the Alexander romance, and it's interesting to note that after the Arabian conquest of Persia, they drew a lot of their stuff from Persian traditions, kind of like how the Romans drew a lot of stuff from the Greeks. This story may have been drawn from the Syriac version and found its way into the Persian version. There is a dispute over whether the Syriac or the Persian version came first, but either way they have a lot in common. And this story even shows up in the Quran, where Alexander the Great is usually, but not always, identified with Dul Qornan, which translates to the Two-Horned Lord, and I'm just going to say I apologize if I messed up that pronunciation. He's called the Two-Horned Lord because he has horns, and in some Christian, Jewish, and Islamic sources, Alexander also has horns. So combine that with the description from the last video, where he has a lion-like mane, teeth as sharp as nails, he's under 5 feet tall, has one black eye, one white eye, and now you give him horns, he starts to sound like some sort of weird tiefling from Dungeons & Dragons, doesn't he? I know that's a bit of a weird tangent, but thanks for following me. Let's get back to the story. In this version of the story, he is asked to raise the walls to protect people from the predations of the tribes of Gog and Magog, and he does that by using Jinn, creating walls of iron shod in bronze. But he turns around and tells everyone that at the end of days, the walls will fall, and Gog and Magog will be unleashed to battle the faithful. I should mention this wall is even referenced in the modern wargame French Crusade, where the Iron Sultanate fights the forces of hell from behind the Iron Wall of Dul Qornan, or the Iron Wall of Iskander, which is manifested into being when the gates of hell were opened in Jerusalem during the Crusades. French Crusade is a very unhinged game, guys. Go ahead and look it up if you want to find some messed up lore. It's on that odd note that I'm going to end this week's video. I hope you found it informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing, as all of that helps me in my eternal battle with the Dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. You can always join the Everwise at my Patreon, where $1 a month gets you a vote on upcoming videos just like this one. Right now, my patrons are voting on the next video as I record this, so please feel free to join them. I will be back next week with that video, and I hope you'll join me. But until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.